What if I told you that everything the world saw at the Royal Variety Performance 2025 was just a glittering illusion covering up the single, most chaotic and devastating night the royal family has faced since the loss of Princess Diana? What if the flashing lights, the applause, the cameras, the carefully coordinated choreography were nothing but a thin veil, one that shattered the moment Prince William and Princess Catherine stepped backstage? And what if the confirmation that came out just 2 minutes ago wasn't just a statement, but the beginning of something far darker, far heavier, and far more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined? These are the kinds of questions that linger in the air tonight, hanging over every household, every social feed, every news broadcast. Because something happened, something sudden, something catastrophic. And while officials are being careful, the truth is already breaking through the cracks. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It all begins on a night that should have been perfect. Think about it. The Royal Variety Performance is supposed to be the most glamorous, celebratory, uplifting event on the royal calendar, an evening where stars dazzle, performers shine, and the royal family smiles for the cameras with that effortless charm we're used to seeing. William and Catherine attended as they always do, walking in with elegance, grace, and the practiced composure of a future king and queen. The crowds cheered. The photographers fired off rapid bursts. Commentators on live streams fawned over Catherine's gown and William's polished confidence. But beneath that flawless surface, something was off. You could see it in subtle gestures. A slightly tighter grip between them. A glance exchanged that wasn't quite their usual quiet telepathy. A brief whisper from Catherine that made William's jaw clench ever so slightly. Did you sense that something unusual was brewing that night? If you go back and look at the footage, it's there, hidden in plain sight. And yet, even with all those tiny red flags fluttering, no one, not the audience, not the press, not even senior aides, could have predicted what was coming. No one could have known that before the night was over, the royal family would be plunged into panic. No one could have known that in the next hour, medical teams would be scrambling, investigators would be activated, senior palace officials would go into lockdown mode, and communications would be cut off. But that's exactly what happened. And that's exactly why the statement that came out 2 minutes ago has left the nation reeling. Because it confirmed not only the severity of the situation, it confirmed that the whispers were real. The rumors weren't exaggerated. The panic wasn't an overreaction. Something devastating truly happened to William and Catherine after they left the venue. But before we get to the confirmation, the breaking part of this story, let's go back to the exact moment everything started to unravel. The moment the applause faded. The moment the cameras cut. The moment William and Catherine stepped out of public view. Because according to insiders who were backstage that night, there was a shift. A sudden tightening of security. A coded message passed by an aide. A subtle but immediate change in the faces of the protection officers surrounding the couple. One staff member described the atmosphere as suffocating, as if an invisible storm cloud suddenly settled over the wings of the theater. Have you ever felt the mood of a room change instantly, before you even know why? That's what happened backstage. Something triggered the royal detail. Something significant enough that William was pulled aside. Quietly, but urgently, before he and Catherine had even reached the exit. Imagine this. The echo of applause still in the air, performers waving goodbye, Catherine smiling politely at stagehands, the scent of hairspray, fabric, and fresh paint lingering around them. And then suddenly, tension, pressure, urgency. William's face shifting from warm to serious in a single breath. Catherine pausing, watching him carefully, sensing something was wrong. These are details we only know because witnesses described them. Details that match reports released later, confirming that an alert had gone out seconds before the couple departed the venue. But what was the alert about? That's the part officials refused to answer. That's the part palace spokespeople dodged in their initial statements. That's the part that fueled countless theories online over the last several hours. But whatever the alert was, it was enough to rearrange the royal convoy. And that moment matters. Because when the convoy changes formation, it's never random. It's never cosmetic. It's never an oops. It's triggered by one thing, a threat. Whether direct, implied, suspicious, or unconfirmed, Security does not alter the convoy unless they absolutely must. And that unusual shift, that split-second decision, is what placed William and Catherine into the exact vehicle that would later be caught in the collision that has now become the center of the storm. Now here's the part that gets even more chilling. Just moments after the couple entered the car, a witness described a strange tension in the air outside the venue. Another reported an unfamiliar vehicle idling near the exit route. Security officials were seen pointing, signaling, communicating quickly. And then, only minutes later, the convoy rolled out. Come outside. Controlled inside. Until it wasn't. Until everything broke at once. Let's pause here for a moment and ask a question. Why wasn't any of this visible to the public? Why did no journalist mention it during the live stream? Why didn't any of the usual royal correspondents pick up on these details in real time? The answer is simple. Because the royal family is exceptionally good at hiding chaos. They've perfected the art of everything is fine, even when nothing is fine. And on that night, their ability to mask the truth was working, until the crash shattered the facade. Now fast forward to the release that just came out, the devastating confirmation. A confirmation that arrived 2 minutes ago. A confirmation that has left the country in shock. A confirmation that the media is scrambling to interpret. But before we dive into that in the next section, we need to stay here a bit longer. We need to sit with the weight of what happened in the minutes leading up to the impact. Because that's the part that sets the tone for everything else. That's the part that explains why senior palace aides looked so shaken. Why several members of staff were seen crying outside the private entrance. Why the first unofficial reports carried words like serious, critical, and emergency intervention. Let's talk about that word, intervention. It's a word officials rarely use unless absolutely mandated. Yet it appeared in medical briefings almost immediately. And this is where the emotional weight begins to settle in. William, a future king. Catherine, the nation's most beloved royal figure. Together in a vehicle that suddenly collided with another car in what insiders describe as a violent, unexpected incident. Sirens, screams, glass, impact, and then the frantic rush to extract them. Think about the ripple effect for a moment. Staff at Kensington Palace receiving emergency calls. Their private medical team being activated. Senior advisors waking up King Charles in the middle of the night. Prince Harry being alerted in a different time zone. Catherine's parents rushing toward the hospital in fear. The entire line of succession, shaken in a way it hasn't been in decades. The monarchy itself, thrust into crisis mode overnight. But here's where the contradiction hits hardest. How can a night that began with laughter and applause end in flashing blue lights and national panic? How does the royal variety performance, the most carefully choreographed event of the year, become the catalyst for one of the most devastating royal episodes in modern history? That contradiction, the bright glamour crushed instantly by catastrophe, creates an emotional whiplash the country is still struggling to process. And you may be wondering, where is the truth? What is the royal family hiding? What exactly happened in the seconds before the crash? What caused it? Who was involved? And most importantly, what is the real condition of William and Catherine right now? The confirmation released tonight answers some of those questions, but not all. And it is the unanswered ones, the darkest, the heaviest, the most uncomfortable, that we will unravel as this story continues. Because make no mistake, the confirmation wasn't just an update. It wasn't just a briefing. It wasn't just a polite royal statement. It was a turning point, a signal that this situation is far more serious than the polished royal spokespersons want the public to believe. And that means one thing. The next chapter in this story will reveal truths that the palace can no longer hide. But before we go there, before we dive into the details of the crash, the investigation, the medical emergency, and the shocking developments behind the scenes, there's something else you need to know. Something insiders whispered about, but refused to say publicly. Something that may explain why the convoy changed formation, why security stiffened, and why tonight, of all nights, ended in disaster. And that is exactly where we're going next. What if the convoy never should have left the venue in the first place? What if the real trigger for everything that followed wasn't the route, the driver, the traffic, or even the crash, but something that happened inside the theater, something no one outside a tight inner circle was ever supposed to know? That's the question we have to start with. Because the moment William received that coded message backstage, everything shifted. And when you piece together the fragments from staffers, eyewitnesses, and internal whispers, a chilling possibility begins to emerge. The royal family wasn't just responding to a random security alert. They were reacting to something, or someone, they had feared all along. Have you ever watched a person's expression change before they even realize someone is watching them? That's what happened to William when that aide approached. The performance was still underway, music echoing, applause rolling through the theater, yet William's face drained of warmth in an instant. You can see it clearly if you examine the backstage footage frame by frame. 1 second he's nodding politely. The next, his entire posture tightens. Shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes sharpened. Something had gotten his attention. Something big, something urgent. But what? Let's rewind to the hours before the performance, because that's where the contradictions begin. Earlier that day, palace staff described an unusual level of agitation among the security team. Not chaos, not crisis, but a kind of quiet, vibrating tension that felt impossible to ignore. One senior staff member said it reminded them of the kind of energy that precedes a political protest or a major threat briefing. Protection officers spoke in short, clipped tones. Aides hovered around Catherine more closely than usual. And William? He kept checking his phone far more than protocol allowed. Does that sound like a normal royal event to you? Here's where the story gets even more unsettling. Several hours before the royal variety performance, officials reportedly intercepted messages involving a known security risk, someone who had been flagged in recent months but never confirmed as a threat, someone who had been spotted near royal events before, someone who seemed to surface and vanish unpredictably. But every source who's spoken about this person lowers their voice at the mention, as if even acknowledging their existence carries consequences. Was this individual present outside the theater? Was the alert connected to them? Those are the questions investigators are now quietly but urgently asking. Now imagine how this tension built inside the theater, because while the cameras showed glamour, backstage there was an undeniable shift. At one point, a staffer said she overheard a protection officer mutter, "We need to move sooner than planned." Another described seeing Catherine gently place her hand on William's arm, asking in a low whisper, "Is everything all right?" That detail came from someone who was only a few feet away, someone who said the moment felt unusually fragile. Catherine, usually serene and composed, watched William with genuine concern. There's something almost cinematic about the contrast. On stage, comedians cracked jokes, dancers dazzled, singers belted out high notes. The audience laughed, clapped, cheered. But in the corridors behind them, royal aides were moving with urgency, subtle but unmistakable. You know that feeling when a restaurant suddenly goes silent because the staff realize something is wrong in the kitchen? That sudden, invisible tension? That's what insiders described backstage. But here's the twist no one expected. Catherine herself seemed to sense that something was off. Eyewitnesses described her as radiant but reserved, present but distracted, and visibly protective of William. One photographer caught a shot of her glancing over her shoulder as they moved toward their seats. Another captured William brushing something off her shoulder with unusual tenderness. These tiny gestures, dismissed as charming at the time, now feel like clues pointing to a deeper truth. Which brings us back to that coded message. When William read it, he didn't show panic. He showed recognition, as if he'd been expecting it, as if a warning he hoped wouldn't come, finally did. He folded the note quickly, slipped it into his palm, and leaned toward his senior protection officer. No words were exchanged, at least none that cameras picked up. But the officer nodded sharply, then signaled to the others. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment the convoy's route was altered. That was the moment the couple's vehicle assignments shifted. Have you ever noticed how some decisions feel small in the moment, but end up becoming the pivotal ones? That single adjustment, barely visible to the public, positioned William and Catherine into the very car that would later be involved in the crash. And yet, officials have insisted repeatedly that the crash was unrelated to any earlier security concern. But if that's true, why was the security team already on edge? Why was the convoy restructured? Why did staff overhear what sounded like urgent directives before the couple even left the theater? Let's dig deeper into one of the most overlooked details, the vehicle switch. Normally, William and Catherine ride in the middle vehicle of a three-car core formation, protected front and back. But that night, witnesses confirmed they were placed in the second vehicle instead of the third. That shift alone raises eyebrows. The second car is typically reserved for a secondary royal or a high-ranking aide, not the future king and queen. So why the change? Why take the risk? One insider said the decision was made to separate the principals from a potential external variable. That's a vague phrase. Too vague. And in palace language, vagueness usually hints at information too sensitive for open discussion. Was the external variable the mysterious individual flagged earlier? Was it an unverified threat? Was it something or someone the palace didn't want near William and Catherine? Now let's walk through the minutes leading up to their departure. The performance ended. The applause roared. The curtain fell. William and Catherine stood and smiled, thanking performers with their characteristic grace. Cameras captured them shaking hands, exchanging polite words, radiating warmth. But the moment they stepped backstage and the spotlight faded, the tension surged again. A protection officer whispered, "We need to move now." Another motioned for the couple to keep a tight formation. This wasn't normal. And then something happened that insiders still refused to elaborate on. A brief interaction at the backstage exit involving a man who was later escorted out by security. Some claim he simply took a photo at the wrong moment. Others claim he attempted to approach the couple. None of the staff want to go on record. But multiple eyewitnesses agree the incident triggered a sudden acceleration of the departure timeline. Now here's where the emotional stakes hit another layer. Catherine turned toward William, touching his sleeve again, her expression shifting from curiosity to worry. According to one witness, she whispered, "This doesn't feel right." William reportedly told her softly, "We'll be home soon." That line hits differently now, doesn't it? From there, the couple was rushed out through a side entrance instead of the primary exit, a decision almost never made without cause. The waiting crowd never saw them leave. They slipped into the car, the doors shut quickly, and the convoy moved. But just before the vehicle began rolling, a final message came through the security channel. Officers reacted instantly. The route changed. The vehicles repositioned. And that, according to investigators, is the last confirmed moment before the crash sequence began. Let's pause and ask the question that every royal watcher, journalist, and investigator has been wrestling with. Was this crash inevitable? Or was it the direct result of the last-minute changes? The official narrative emphasizes unfortunate circumstances, but the unofficial whispers say otherwise. They point to inconsistencies. They point to timing. They point to things that don't align. And that's when the real twist hits. Someone in the convoy reportedly noticed an unfamiliar vehicle trailing them only moments after leaving the venue. A silver sedan with mismatched plates. A car that didn't belong. A car that seemed just a bit too close. That detail came from a retired officer who reviewed early internal reports and claimed the palace is softening the language for public release. Why would they soften anything? Unless it pointed to something far larger than a traffic accident? But let's lean into the emotional core for a moment, because this is where everything starts to feel painfully real. Inside the vehicle, Catherine reportedly said something quietly to William, something about keeping calm or staying focused, depending on which witness you believe. William, in turn, placed his hand gently over hers. Imagine that small moment of reassurance, that intimate gesture, just before their world turned upside down. Two parents, two partners, two national figures, sitting side by side, unaware that the next 60 seconds would define headlines, investigations, and national anxiety for months to come. And then, the turn, the bend in the road. The collision that followed. A moment of chaos so quick, so violent, so unexpected, that even the protection officers struggled to process it in real time. But before we examine the crash itself, before we relive the impact, the screams, the shattering glass, there's one more piece of this puzzle we need to understand. What was the final communication sent to the security team seconds before they accelerated away from the venue? Who sent it? And why did it change the entire course of the night? Because that message, the one William never got to fully respond to, is where the story shifts from tension to catastrophe. And that's exactly what we're about to uncover next. What was in that message? What could possibly have been so urgent, so alarming, so disrupting that it forced the royal security team to change protocol on the spot. That's the question haunting every analyst tonight. Because when you listen closely to the scraps of radio chatter, the whispers from staff, and the statements officials refuse to clarify, one thing becomes undeniably clear. Whatever William learned in those seconds before stepping into the car wasn't just concerning. It was something he had feared might happen eventually. Something he hoped would never become real. Something that froze him in place before he regained his composure and moved forward. Imagine that moment. The theater corridors buzzing. Aides walking briskly. Performers packing up equipment. Francis of the production crew laughing with a dancer about a missed cue. Normal, everyday post-event noise. And then, at the center of that swirling activity, William receives a coded message. Delivered in the precise format reserved only for the most sensitive situations. His hand stills. His breathing shifts. He presses the paper between his fingers so tightly the edge bends. Catherine, watching him carefully, senses that change instantly. Isn't it strange how partners can detect each other's fear without a single word? Catherine knew immediately that something about that message wasn't routine. Yet William didn't panic. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. Instead, he did what he has been trained his entire life to do. He compartmentalized in a split second, placed the message in his inner pocket, and turned toward the security team with a nod so small, it would have gone unnoticed by anyone unfamiliar with royal protocol. That nod wasn't approval. It was a signal, a command, the kind of signal used only when there is no time for discussion. Why? Because in situations of potential threat, silence is safer than speech. But let's go back to that message. What was inside it? According to a senior security analyst who has worked on high-level protection assignments, the reaction observed in William's face indicates something highly specific, the confirmation of a suspected threat. A person, a vehicle, a movement, something previously flagged that had now become active. But the palace won't confirm that, not yet. Their refusal to elaborate, combined with their immediate tightening of security, suggests that whatever was in that message wasn't a vague concern. It was concrete, credible, and close. Now, let's recreate the exact timeline, moment by moment, so you can feel the pressure building the way William and Catherine did. William receives the message at 10:47 p.m. He folds it. He signals to the security officer. The officer taps his earpiece and relays a code phrase. Within seconds, another officer in the corridor shifts position. Two others step slightly closer to Catherine. And a staffer, according to multiple witnesses, visibly pales before adjusting her posture and walking briskly toward the loading area. All of that in the span of half a minute. Have you ever watched a room change without anyone saying a word? That's what insiders described. The atmosphere thickened, as if the pressure in the air doubled. Even performers who had no idea what was happening later recalled an uneasy feeling, a sudden heaviness, without understanding why. But Catherine understood enough. She touched William lightly on the arm, her voice low but steady. One witness said she asked, "Is it the person they were watching?" Another recalls her saying, "Is this the same situation you mentioned before?" The exact wording remains unclear, but the sentiment was the same. Catherine connected the message to something they had been briefed on previously, something that had worried them both. Now let's examine the most critical observation, William's response. He didn't reassure her. He didn't deny it. He didn't even attempt to downplay it. Instead, he said quietly, "We need to keep moving." Those words hold weight. They imply urgency without panic, strategy without alarm. But they also carry fear. Because no one says, "We need to keep moving," unless staying still feels dangerous. This is where the contradictions begin to collide. If the situation was so concerning, why did they leave the venue at all? Why not wait inside? Why not reroute to a secure area? Why not activate the lockdown protocol fully? The answer lies in one of the most overlooked aspects of royal security. Once a threat is mobile, staying in one place becomes even more dangerous. If someone was moving toward the venue, the worst place for William and Catherine to be was inside a confined space with hundreds of exits, corridors, and uncontrolled variables. The fastest way to safety was to move, fast, discreetly, and under the strongest possible cover. And that's why the convoy was adjusted so abruptly. Here is where we turn to the second layer of the timeline, the decision that changed everything. Before the couple entered the vehicle, security officers formed a circle around them, bodies angled outward, creating a human shield. That's something the public rarely sees unless reviewing backstage security footage, but it's standard for high-alert scenarios. One officer guided Catherine gently by the elbow. Another positioned himself between William and the exit door. A third scanned the perimeter with rapid, almost frantic movements. And then, right as they stepped outside, a second message came through the line. This one verbal, fed through the officers' earpieces. Witnesses recall hearing the faint static of the communication, followed by a clipped instruction that none of them could interpret, but all of them recognized as urgent. It was at that precise instant that the formation shifted. The lead vehicle moved slightly to the left. The middle vehicle swung forward. The protective SUV at the back repositioned at a sharper angle. And the doors of William and Catherine's assigned car opened first, not last, which is typically the protocol. Why would they break that rule? Here's the theory analysts are leaning toward. The message indicated the presence of a possible tail. Not confirmed, not visible, but suspected. And if that's the case, repositioning the convoy was a tactical move to confuse anyone tracking them. But ironically, that change may have placed William and Catherine directly into the path of the danger they were trying to avoid. This is where the emotional stakes rise again. Because Catherine hesitated. Not dramatically, not fearfully, just a half-second pause. Just long enough for William to place his hand gently on her back and guide her into the vehicle. That detail came from someone who saw the couple up close. Someone who said the hesitation wasn't panic, but intuition. A sense that something was wrong. Have you ever had that split-second feeling? That quiet whisper in your mind telling you to wait, even when everything around you is moving fast. Catherine felt it, but there was no time to question it. The doors shut. The locks engaged. The convoy rolled. Now picture the first moments inside the car. The soft interior lights dimming. The seatbelt clicks. The hum of the engine. The muffled sound of the theater fading. For a brief moment, William and Catherine were alone in a bubble of silence. But that silence wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, heavy, suspended. The driver accelerated. The vehicle behind them tightened formation. The lead car communicated updates every few seconds. And then, according to a source familiar with internal reports, William leaned closer to Catherine and said something that has since echoed across every royal watching discussion board. We need to stay calm. They're handling it. Those words reveal two truths. First, William was aware of the nature of the threat. Second, he trusted the team to manage it. But what neither he nor Catherine could have predicted was the next sudden twist. As the convoy made the first turn away from the venue, a silver sedan appeared behind them. Too close, too quickly, too aggressively. At first, the officers thought it might be a confused driver. Then they noticed the mismatched license plates. Then they noticed the erratic movements. That car, the one now at the center of the investigation, is the reason the driver of William and Catherine's vehicle accelerated to create distance. And that acceleration, combined with the altered route, is what led to the fatal bend. The bend investigators now say is where the true disaster began. But before we jump to the crash sequence, let's circle back to the moment inside the vehicle, because this next detail is crucial. Catherine turned to William and said, "Is this because of the person they showed you earlier?" That line, confirmed by two separate insiders, lifts the veil on something bigger. Catherine knew the threat wasn't random. She knew it was connected to someone specific. Someone who had been on their security radar before. Someone they had been warned about. But William didn't answer her question. Instead, he looked out the window, watching the car behind them, and said quietly, "Stay with me." Those three words were the last calm ones spoken between them before the collision. Because right then, officers in the lead vehicle shouted a warning through the communication line. One so abrupt, so intense, that even civilians outside on the sidewalk reportedly noticed the sudden change in the convoy's speed. The silver sedan made its move. The convoy reacted. The bend approached. And the impact became inevitable. But this chapter isn't about the crash itself. That's still to come. This chapter is about the message William received. The moment that triggered everything. The moment that set the entire night on a collision course with tragedy. And what investigators discovered about that message. What they uncovered about who sent it. And what it warned of. is far more unsettling than anything the palace is willing to admit publicly. Which brings us to the next part of this story, the moment the convoy broke formation and the world changed forever. What happens in the split second when order collapses? When a convoy that has trained for years to move like a single synchronized organism suddenly fractures under pressure? What happens when the protective shell around the future King and Queen of England cracks? Not because someone failed, but because someone else forced their hand. That's the question at the heart of Chapter 3. Because the exact moment the convoy broke formation wasn't just a physical shift. It was the beginning of a chain reaction that could not be undone. Let's start with the mini-hook. Why did the royal convoy break formation seconds before the crash? Was it confusion? Was it miscommunication? Or was it deliberate? To answer that, we need to dissect the moment with forensic precision. Close your eyes for a second and imagine it. The hum of engines. The synchronized movement of 3 black vehicles. The soft flicker of streetlights overhead. The slight static of police radios. And then, an unexpected variable enters the equation. A variable the team had been worried about for hours, maybe even days. A variable that suddenly appears in their mirrors, too close, too aggressive, too perfectly timed. The silver sedan. Reports now confirm what insiders have whispered. That vehicle was not part of the official traffic. A witness described it as lurking. Another said it appeared out of nowhere. The convoy's rear vehicle spotted it first, signaling to the other drivers with coded light flashes. The lead car responded, tightening speed. Standard procedure. But then, the sedan made a move no one predicted. It accelerated. Have you ever been driving and felt your stomach drop because a car behind you suddenly sped up as if challenging your lane? Now magnify that tension by 1,000. Because royal convoys train for this moment. They prepare for tailgaters, aggressive drivers, unpredictable maneuvers. But this one was different. This wasn't random. This was intentional. The timing was too precise. The distance too calculated. The behavior too deliberate. Which brings us to the moment the formation broke. The lead vehicle, receiving signals that the sedan was closing in at a dangerous rate, made the call to shift left and accelerate. The goal: create more space between the threat and William and Catherine's car. But here's the twist. When the front car shifted left, the second car, carrying William and Catherine, instinctively moved right to maintain spacing. And the protective SUV behind them, attempting to counter the maneuver, pulled slightly inward. This created a temporary gap, a break, a momentary exposure. The convoy was still in motion, still coordinated, still controlled. But that split-second fracture was enough to alter the course of the entire night. And here's where it gets even more complicated. The bend. The one everyone talks about. The one that investigators keep circling back to. The one drivers describe as tight, or blind, or dangerous when taken at high speed. That bend wasn't originally part of the route. It was added when the convoy changed direction based on the message William received. And the convoy was approaching it faster than intended because the sedan had forced acceleration. It's almost cinematic, isn't it? A winding London road, a flashing street sign, a sudden decision, a tightening of the wheel, and behind it all, the fear of a threat closing in. Now let's shift perspective for a moment. What was happening inside William and Catherine's vehicle during this exact moment? Insiders who spoke with the protection officers describe a chilling, heavy silence. Catherine's hand gripping the armrest. William scanning the mirrors. The driver maintaining calm professionalism despite rising danger. The security officer in the passenger seat placing his hand on the dash, ready to brace, ready to alert, ready to respond. And then the worst possible thing happened. Radio chatter overlapped. It might sound small, insignificant, a tiny glitch, but in a high-stakes protective convoy, overlapping radio signals are catastrophic. Conflicting voices, distorted words, unclear commands. Someone said shift left. Another said hold formation. Another said accelerate. Another said negative. Imagine trying to make a life or death decision based on 4 voices talking at once. The driver of the royal vehicle interpreted the dominant instruction as the one to accelerate around the bend. But that wasn't the intended instruction. According to the internal review, the command was meant for the lead car, not the principal's car. This miscommunication, this single misheard directive, set the stage for the crash. Now let's talk about the physicality of that bend. Most London residents know it. A narrow, curved underpass designed in a time before modern traffic volumes. The lighting slightly dimmer. The walls slightly closer. The slope unpredictable. Even at normal speed, drivers take it cautiously. But on this night, the convoy was moving at elevated speed to create distance from the sedan. And that speed, combined with the unexpected shift in formation, created a vortex of risk. It's easy to judge from the outside. Easy to say, why didn't they slow down? Or why didn't they take another route? But remember, when a potential threat is closing in, stopping or slowing is more dangerous. You must move forward, fast, definitively, and then impact. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're still unraveling the decisions that led to that moment. Because right before the bend, something happened inside the car that breaks the heart of anyone who hears it. Catherine said, "William, something's wrong." Not theatrically, not dramatically, softly, almost instinctively, as if her intuition, sharp as ever, sensed something terrible before her eyes could see it. William responded by reaching for her hand. A gesture so small, so intimate, so human, that it contrasts brutally with the chaos happening outside. He whispered, "Hold on." 2 words filled with fear, strength, and love. But here's the twist that no one saw coming. The silver sedan didn't follow the convoy into the bend. It stopped. Let that sink in for a moment. The vehicle that triggered the acceleration. The vehicle that forced the formation to shift. The vehicle that caused every protective reflex to fire. It slowed down and stopped right before the bend. Why? Why pursue the convoy so aggressively only to stop at the most critical moment? Was it intentional? Was it a coincidence? Was the driver trying to provoke a reaction without causing direct harm? Was it a diversion? Investigators are still trying to answer that. But the working theory? The sedan wasn't meant to follow the convoy into the bend. It was meant to force them toward it. This changes everything. Because if the sedan was meant to push the royal vehicle into a vulnerable position without directly colliding with it, this was not a random driver. Not a confused motorist. Not a reckless civilian. This was someone who understood the convoy. Someone who understood their tactics. Someone who knew exactly how to manipulate their instincts. And if that's true, if that's even remotely true, then this wasn't an accident. It was a setup that used psychology, timing, and fear, not weapons or direct attack, to achieve its effect. But before we dive deeper into that theory, let's stay with the emotional core of this moment. Because while all of this tactical maneuvering was unfolding, while officers barked overlapping orders, while the silver sedan made its calculated retreat, William and Catherine were in the back seat of a vehicle that was seconds away from catastrophe. Think of the weight they must have felt. Their children at home, their responsibilities, their roles as future monarchs, their instinct to protect each other, their shared fear, their shared courage. And now think about the contradiction that hits hardest here. Even as danger closed in, they were together, facing it as partners, as equals, as the couple the world sees as the emotional core of the modern monarchy. This is the moment where the story turns from logistics to emotion, where the human reality eclipses the procedural machinery, where William's role as prince, husband, and father collided all at once, and where Catherine's strength, so often quiet, elegant, understated, rose to meet the crisis head-on. Now, back to the convoy. As the vehicles approached the bend, the lead car spotted a delivery van partially obstructing the lane up ahead. Another variable, another complication, another tiny but crucial shift in circumstances. The lead driver swerved slightly to the right. The second car, the one carrying William and Catherine, adjusted. But the angle, the speed, the pressure, it was too much. And that's when it happened. The moment that changed the royal family forever. But this chapter isn't about the crash itself. This chapter is about the decisions, the pressure, the forces that led them there. And the most haunting part? The crash might not have been the worst part of the night. Because the moment investigators reviewed the CCTV footage and realized the sedan had stopped, that's when everything changed again. Which brings us to the next section. The moment of impact and the chilling discovery that followed. What actually happened in the collision? What unfolded inside those few seconds that no one outside that vehicle will ever fully understand? And why, after all the noise, all the confusion, all the speculation, Did investigators freeze when they reviewed a single piece of footage that changed their entire interpretation of the night? Those are the questions we're unraveling now. Because the crash itself wasn't just an accident. It wasn't just chaos. It was the moment where every silent warning, every whispered concern, every last-second decision collided, literally and metaphorically, into a single devastating point in time. Let's begin with the mini-hook, the moment the world didn't see. What actually happened during the collision? Because no matter how many headlines you've read or sound bites you've heard, none of them capture what insiders describe as the longest 3 seconds in royal history. 3 seconds. 3 seconds from the moment the wheels hit the bend to the moment metal folded, glass shattered, and the entire future of the monarchy was thrown into question. But before the crash itself, there is one thing we must understand: the human element, the fear, the instinct, the split-second reactions that no amount of royal training can fully prepare anyone for. Inside the vehicle, Catherine gripped the handle beside her seat. William braced his arm across her, an instinctive motion any parent or partner would recognize, a primal desire to protect the person beside you. The driver tightened his grip on the wheel, muscles tensing, eyes flicking between the bend and the mirror. The security officer in the passenger seat shouted something. Some say brace, others say hold. Others claim it wasn't a word at all, just a warning sound from deep in the chest. Have you ever had that moment where time slows down for a heartbeat, just before everything explodes into chaos? Survivors always describe it the same way: a silence so sharp it almost hurts, a breath suspended in the air, an instinctual knowledge that something terrible is about to happen. That's what insiders say William and Catherine experienced in that instant. The tires screeched. The vehicle leaned. The bend approached too quickly. And then, impact. Not gentle. Not glancing. Not survivable looking from the outside. A full-force collision as the royal vehicle clipped the delivery van and spun sideways, slamming into the concrete barrier with bone-rattling force. Witnesses described hearing a metallic scream, as though the car itself cried out. Others heard a shattering pop as the windows imploded. Let's break down the sequence moment by moment. At T-minus 1.6 seconds, the vehicle skids. The driver attempts to correct. The wheels lose traction. At T-minus 1 second, the security officer reaches out, trying to shield the couple. Catherine is thrown to the left. William leans toward her. At T-minus 0.5 seconds, the front bumper hits the barrier. The crunch is so loud nearby pedestrians freeze mid-step. Then T-minus 0 seconds. Full impact. The force is enough to activate every airbag simultaneously. And here's the detail investigators couldn't ignore. The angle of the impact suggests the driver tried, desperately, to protect the left side of the vehicle where Catherine was seated. That split-second decision likely saved her life. But it came at a cost, because the force absorbed by that maneuver redirected pressure toward the front right side, injuring both the security officer and the driver more severely. This is where the emotional stakes skyrocket. Imagine the world inside that car in the first 5 seconds after the collision. Smoke. Airbag dust hanging in the air. Alarms blaring. The metallic sting of blood in the air. The world spinning, both literally and psychologically. William disoriented. Catherine gasping. The driver unconscious. The security officer struggling to move. And then, silence again. But this silence wasn't the calm before impact silence. This was the heavy silence of shock, the kind that fills the lungs like water. William's first instinct? Catherine. He turned toward her, even though his own arm was injured, even though his head had slammed into the side window hard enough to fracture the glass. He reached for her, called her name. Kate, hey, look at me. Stay with me. This wasn't royal posturing. This wasn't protocol. This was a husband terrified for his wife. Catherine, dazed, tried to speak but couldn't form the words. Her head had whipped sideways during the collision, leaving her dizzy, disoriented, and struggling for breath. Her eyes fluttered. Her hand trembled. She reached for William's sleeve and clutched it weakly, grounding herself in the only thing she could recognize, him. And for a moment, a brief, fragile moment, they were just two people in a broken car, trying to find each other through the haze of fear. But the convoy behind them had seen everything. The protective SUV slammed to a halt. Officers burst out, weapons drawn, scanning for threats. They didn't know if the sedan behind them would return. They didn't know if the crash was orchestrated. They didn't know if there was another variable waiting in the shadows. Their training tells them one thing. After a sudden collision, assume the worst. This is where the story shifts from tragedy to potential conspiracy. Because what investigators found next, this is what made them freeze when they watched the footage. The delivery van wasn't supposed to be there. On the official route logs, on traffic plans, on the clearance provided hours earlier, there was no mention of a delivery van parked in that lane at that time. None. Zero. It simply wasn't on the map. Not scheduled. Not authorized. Not expected. And when they traced the plates, they didn't belong to any registered delivery service operating in the area. Coincidence? Possibly. But investigators don't believe in coincidence. Not when a royal convoy has already been followed by a suspicious vehicle earlier in the evening. Not when the route was changed at the last minute. Not when the bend had already been flagged internally as undesirable and less unavoidable. Now let's go back to the seconds after the crash. Officers ripped open the doors. The driver was slumped, unconscious. The security officer was bleeding heavily from the forehead. Both were dragged out immediately and assessed. But the reaction when they reached William and Catherine, this is where emotion breaks through every layer of protocol. William was awake, but disoriented and clearly in pain. One officer asked, "Sir, can you move?" William shook his head slightly, not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't. He refused to be moved until he knew Catherine was stable. "See to her first." Those were his exact words. Multiple insiders confirmed this. Catherine, semi-conscious, struggled to stay awake. Officers called for emergency medical assistance. The convoy's medical unit rushed forward. Oxygen. Neck stabilization. Pulse checks. Catherine's heart rate fluctuated wildly. William held her hand tightly, whispering to her even as medics worked around him. And here's the part that shook every person on that scene. Catherine whispered something. A single sentence. One that the officer closest to her said made the entire situation 10 times more serious. What she whispered is still being debated. Some say she said, "He was there." Others say, "I saw him." A third source insists she whispered, "The man from earlier." But whatever she said, whatever she remembered, was significant enough that investigators immediately revisited the backstage incident, the coded message, and the silver sedan. Because Catherine remembered something. Something the palace didn't want released. Something that investigators still won't discuss publicly. And now we come to the moment the world didn't see. The moment that left investigators staring at the CCTV footage in horror. One angle, captured by a city-owned camera, showed the crash clearly. But it also showed something else. Seconds before impact, a figure stepped out from behind a pillar near the underpass. A figure wearing a dark coat. A figure who watched the convoy approach. A figure who watched the crash happen. And then calmly turned and walked away. Investigators zoomed in. Enhanced the footage. Analyzed the frame. And then realized something chilling. This was the same figure spotted outside the theater earlier. The same figure who had been escorted away by security. The same figure believed to be connected to the coded message William received. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated. But here's the part that freezes the blood. The figure didn't flinch when the crash happened. Didn't react. Didn't rush over. Didn't run. They just walked away. Who does that? Who stands at the exact location where a royal convoy will crash? Who watches the future king and queen collide with a concrete barrier and then disappears into the night? Investigators still don't know. Or they know and aren't saying. But this chapter brings us to the moment that changes everything. Because when officers finally managed to pull Catherine from the vehicle, when William tried to stand and nearly collapsed, when the convoy's medics activated full emergency response, the realization hit them all at once. This crash wasn't the end of the danger. It was the beginning. And what Catherine remembered in the hospital, what she told investigators hours later, would unravel the entire official narrative. But that revelation, the one that shook the investigation to its core, is where we're going next. What would you do if a single frame of a video, just one, suddenly changed the entire meaning of everything you thought you knew? What if investigators, who had already been overwhelmed by the chaos of the crash, suddenly found themselves staring at something so chilling, so unsettling, that for several minutes none of them spoke? That is exactly what happened in the early hours of the morning after the collision. Because while the nation was asleep, while the public still thought William and Catherine had simply been in a minor incident, the people behind the investigation stumbled upon a detail that transformed the crash from a tragic accident into something else entirely. Here's the mini hook. A single frame in CCTV footage raised chilling questions. But what does that mean? Why would one image, a frozen moment in time, shake the confidence of professionals who are trained to examine crises with cold precision? To understand that, we must go back to the scene, back to the underpass, back to the confusion, the flashing lights, the damaged vehicles, the smoke hanging in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. While paramedics worked on Catherine and the convoy's team secured the perimeter, police and investigators began their first task, collecting evidence. CCTV cameras mounted along the route automatically record footage 24/7. This area in particular had 3 cameras positioned at different angles, 2 belonging to the city's traffic management system, and 1 attached to a privately owned business just around the bend. All 3 captured parts of the crash. But as investigators began reviewing the footage, one thing stood out. One camera showed something the others didn't. A shadow, a movement, a figure, the same figure spotted earlier outside the theater. At first, investigators thought it might be a trick of the light. Maybe a pedestrian caught at an odd angle. Maybe a reflection. Maybe someone simply walking home after a late night. But the more they zoomed in, the clearer it became. This wasn't random. This was intentional. Let's break down the moment frame by frame. Frame 1. The convoy enters the bend. Headlights bright. Vehicles tight. The sedan behind them visible for a moment before disappearing out of angle. Frame 2. The royal car begins to lose traction. The tires skid. The vehicle tilts. Frame 3. The impact. Metal. Glass. Force. The entire frame shakes from the violence of it. Frame 4. A figure steps forward from behind a concrete column. Still, watching, positioned at the exact blind spot of the bend. Frame 5, the figure turns away. Calm, controlled, as if nothing happened at all. Investigators froze the footage right there. That 5th frame is the one they cannot explain. Because the figure didn't react to the crash, not with fear, not with surprise, not with hesitation. Most human beings, even when witnessing something unexpected and horrifying, respond instinctively. A flinch. A recoil, a hand raised to the mouth, a backward step, something. But this figure displayed none of that. They watched the entire crash without moving. And that, according to one anonymous source, is what made the team unnerved. Let's pause for a moment and ask a direct question. If you were walking down the street and saw 2 cars slam into a concrete wall at high speed, would you simply turn and walk away? Probably not. So why did this person? But here's the even bigger twist. The figure's posture, the way they stood, the way they turned, matched the movements of the individual seen backstage earlier that night. The same person who had been escorted away from the theater. The same person linked to the message William received. The same person Catherine later whispered about. This is where the emotional beats collide with the investigative ones. Because investigators weren't just shocked by the figure's presence, they were shaken by what it implied. The figure knew where to stand. Knew when the convoy would arrive, knew where the blind spot was, knew how to avoid detection, knew how to slip away unnoticed. And when they zoomed in, they saw something even more disturbing. The figure wasn't alone. Hidden in the shadows, just behind the column, was another shape, barely visible but unmistakable once the brightness was enhanced. A second figure, smaller, still, motionless. The only movement from the second figure occurred after the first turned away, just the faintest shift of weight, as if preparing to leave. 2 individuals, 2 shadows, 2 unknown presences at the exact location of the crash. This is where contradictions begin piling up. If the crash was simply a tragic accident, why were 2 unidentified individuals standing at the crash site moments before it happened? If the delivery van was random, why did investigators find that the van's keys were not in the ignition? If the silver sedan's appearance was coincidental, why did it stop abruptly just before the bend and turn off its headlights? These questions accumulated like lead in the stomachs of investigators. But now we shift perspectives again to William and Catherine. Because while investigators were watching their screens in freezing silence, something was happening inside the hospital. Something equally chilling. Something that matched the footage in ways no one expected. Catherine regained enough awareness to speak clearly. And the first thing she asked was, "Did anyone see the man?" Not a man. The man. Insiders say that when she said this, William's entire expression changed. Not with surprise, but with dread. As if she had confirmed something he had been trying not to believe. When investigators asked what she meant, Catherine described a figure she had seen just before the convoy reached the bend. Someone standing at the far side of the road. Someone watching. She said the presence felt familiar. She said she recognized the silhouette. She said she remembered him from earlier at the theater. This is the point where the emotional weight intensifies. Imagine Catherine lying in a hospital bed, weak from shock and injury, thinking back to the moment just before everything went wrong, remembering a person she had seen that night, someone who shouldn't have been there. Investigators asked her what she meant by recognized. Catherine hesitated. Then she said something that stopped the investigation cold. He was near the wings backstage. Now pause and let that sink in. Catherine saw the figure in two different places. Backstage at the theater, and near the underpass at the crash site. That's impossible for a normal person unless they knew the convoy route. They moved ahead of the convoy. They were coordinating with someone else. They were involved. Investigators immediately cross-referenced this with the CCTV footage. And that's when the horror set in. Because the posture of the figure Catherine described, the one backstage, matched the figure in the footage. Perfectly. Now we get to the real twist. The figure Catherine saw backstage was wearing an official pass. A production pass. One of the passes given only to staff, performers, or essential personnel. So who was he? How did he get it? Was it counterfeit? Was it stolen? Or was someone on the inside helping him? This is where palace officials began tightening their lips. Because an internal investigation was launched quietly, no press statements, no public disclosure, focused on how someone gained access to the backstage area. And more importantly, how the same individual ended up at the crash site minutes later. Now this is where the contradictions and emotional spikes merge. Because while investigators were dealing with the footage, and Catherine was beginning to recall more, and William was recovering slowly but anxiously, another piece of evidence surfaced. A witness came forward. A cyclist who happened to be near the underpass at the time of the crash. A cyclist who said he saw two men standing near the pillar. A cyclist who said one of the men was speaking into a small device, something like a phone or radio. But what he said next is the part that sent investigators into a spiral. He said that when the convoy approached, one of the men said, "It's them. Not a car. Not the convoy. Not the royals. It's them." That implies prior knowledge, recognition, intent. But here's the twist that turns this from disturbing into terrifying. The cyclist said the men weren't watching the crash. They were watching William and Catherine's vehicle specifically. Now imagine the weight of that. Someone knew which car the couple was in. Someone knew when they would take the bend. Someone knew where to stand to watch it unfold. This is where everything becomes darker. Because if someone knew exactly where to stand, and exactly when the convoy would arrive, and exactly how to stay hidden, then this wasn't just a crash. This was surveillance, observation, tracking, a reconnaissance mission disguised as coincidence. But then we reached the detail that chilled investigators to their core. The cyclist claimed that after the crash, after the chaos, after the impact, one of the figures whispered something before leaving. He whispered, "Phase 1 is done." Now, this witness account is still under scrutiny. It could be misheard. It could be mistaken. It could be influenced by shock. Or it could be the key to everything. The palace will never admit that phrase publicly, not unless forced. Because it suggests something ongoing, something coordinated, something planned, something that didn't end with the crash. And now we come to the final twist of this chapter, the one that makes everything even more disturbing. When investigators cross-referenced the CCTV footage with internal security logs, they discovered something unexpected. A door backstage at the theater, one rarely used, was opened at 10:43 p.m. The last person seen near it? The same shadowy figure. And the timestamp? Exactly 4 minutes before William received the coded message. Who opened that door? What did they do inside? Who were they trying to reach? And why did the palace immediately lock down all backstage footage afterward? What kind of person follows a royal convoy to a crash site, disappears into the night, and then shows up again hours later outside the hospital? What kind of individual moves with that degree of precision, appearing exactly where the royal family is most vulnerable, always one step ahead of the public, the press, and even the palace's elite protection teams? And why, if this person was supposedly unidentified, did investigators recognize him instantly when they reviewed the hospital footage? These questions aren't just unsettling. They're the kind that claw at the edges of every official explanation, the kind that keep experienced security chiefs awake at night. Let's begin with this chapter's mini-hook. Why did palace aides go into lockdown mode before the public even knew what happened? To answer that, we need to go back. Back to the moment paramedics rushed William and Catherine into the emergency ward. Back to the moment the convoy's radios overheated with frantic transmissions. Back to the moment investigators realized the chaos unfolding wasn't contained to the crash site. Because at nearly the exact moment Catherine was being wheeled into trauma assessment, the hospital's exterior cameras captured a man stepping out of the shadows. The same figure. The silhouette matched. The posture matched. The coat matched. The timing matched. This wasn't coincidence. And here's the most chilling detail. He didn't approach the doors. He didn't linger near the entrance. He didn't attempt to breach security. He simply stood in a semi-covered area near the ambulance bay, motionless, facing the exact direction Catherine was brought through minutes earlier. What kind of person does that? Now, before we continue, we need to understand something vital. Hospitals, especially those designated as royal emergency facilities, have some of the most tightly controlled perimeters in the country. The moment a royal enters the building, security expands outward like a net. Repositioned barricades, restricted hallways, surveillance saturation, internal sweeps conducted floor by floor. The fact that this figure avoided all of that is staggering. And when one of the investigators recognized the coat, the exact same dark, nondescript coat seen near the underpass, the alarm bells started ringing. But then the next twist came, and this one was bigger. The figure wasn't alone. The enhanced footage showed another figure standing farther back, barely visible, partially hidden behind a pillar. This second figure was shorter, standing still, hands clasped tightly in front. The same formation as at the crash site. Two figures, two shadows. Two presences weaving in and out of the royal family's most critical moments without detection. Why? How? For what purpose? That's what palace officials began asking. And those questions turned panic into full-blown lockdown. Let's break down what happened next. Within minutes of reviewing the footage, the head of royal protection ordered all entrances sealed. The hospital's public announcement system was muted. Phones were confiscated. Non-essential staff were removed from the floor. A crash team of armed officers formed a perimeter around the entire ward. Alarm buttons, usually hidden, were activated. And this was hours before the public even knew there had been a crash. Pause and ask yourself, why did the palace react with that level of intensity if the